CATS is an international policy advocacy think tank that has consistently worked on optimal governance and consumer-facing issues since its inception back in 1983. Taking our mandate forward, we are gathered here today to unpack regulatory developments in the non-personal data landscape, also discuss and revisit the non-personal data debates that have ensued, and deliberate on the way forward for non-personal data governance. We are elated to have a stellar panel of experts who are leading names in the data domain for this important deliberation today, and an extremely diverse range of stakeholders as our audience. Thank you so much for joining in. The flow of the webinar will be as such. We'll start with opening remarks and launch of the CUTS report titled NPD 2.0. This will be followed by a short presentation on the report, after which we will have the panel discussion and Q&A session. In the end, we will present a few key points of discussion in the closing remarks. Before we dive into today's invigorating session, just a few housekeeping announcements. The first is that this event is being recorded. The video will be uploaded subsequently on our YouTube channel. We encourage all participants to ask questions. Please feel free to direct them to our team, that is Amol, Siddharth, and me. We shall try to club questions together and pose them to the panel on the go. Thirdly, we request the audience to keep themselves muted throughout the session, and speakers are encouraged to keep their videos on. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Pradeep Mehta, the founder and Secretary General of CUTS International, to deliver the opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vidushi, and let me join Vidushi in welcoming you all to this webinar. What I'm going to speak about is certain facts, the stylized facts, but it's still important to reiterate it for record. I mean, India is one of the fastest growing data generating nations in the world, with over 700 million internet users and over 400 million smartphone users. Together, they generate over 150 exabytes of data annually. That's a huge amount, humongous amount. In his recent address at the BRICS Business Forum, Honorable Prime Minister Modi pointed out that India's digital economy is expected to be worth $1 trillion by 2025. We are setting new records in data consumption and are among those countries where data is the cheapest. There are more than 100 unicorns in over 70,000 startups in India, and their number continues to grow. It's counting. Moreover, 5,000 patents are being filed every month. The government e-marketplace portal has over 50 lakh sellers. 12 to 15 lakh Indians are booking tickets online. Drones are being used to sprinkle fertilizers, and digital mapping of property in villages is underway. This kind of digital transformation and data usage has never been witnessed anywhere in the world. While phenomenal, these developments are happening amidst absence of robust personal data protection law and infrastructure challenges. Misinformation and problematic content on the internet is spreading like wildfire. Exclusion, cyber breaches, and privacy violation risks have increased manifold, and concerns around data misuse and surveillance have also heightened. The digital economy needs to work for all, particularly the most vulnerable. While ensuring an enabling environment for it to grow, all stakeholders need to come together to deliberate on the problems and discuss possible solutions in good faith. We will not have an inclusive developed digital economy in an environment of mistrust and suspicion. Government, industry, and civil society will need to lose their inhibitions and adopt a collaborative approach instead of an adversarial one. The element of opacity and surprise in policy making needs to be done away with. For instance, the inclusion of non-personal data in the Personal Data Protection Bill came as a surprise to most stakeholders and happened without much deliberations. Not much is known about the current status of the Data Protection Bill. Since then, the government has issued multiple sector-specific and cross-sectoral policy drafts to leverage the potential of data economy. These cover critical sectors like agriculture, health, finance, and provide for data sharing amongst government departments and between government and the industry. Such policies often deal with personal and non-personal data without necessarily acknowledging the complexities or sensitivities involved, and without building adequate ring fence around their misuse. Such approach needs to be avoided. The government should clearly lay down its objectives, problems it aims to solve, and possible approaches it is considering. It must also take into account state capacity and implementability of its proposals. This is a very serious matter. Quite often, government comes out with policy when it doesn't have the kind of capacity to implement it, and therefore, it's like they act more like cliffhangers. The private sector, on its part, clean must come clean to highlight efforts it is making to address the issues identified and areas in which it can do better. Such co-regulatory approach should be the optimal way forward to get data governance 2.0 right. At Cuts, we have done a lot of evidence-based research around data governance, including on non-personal data. Our latest report on non-personal data governance 2.0 is being launched today. I request all panelists to join me in this launch. I hope our stellar panel will discuss some of the ideas mentioned today and help us present a way forward on data governance for the government to consider. With this, I once again welcome all the distinguished speakers and the distinguished participants to this webinar and hand over the proceedings to Vidushi to present findings and recommendations of our report. Over to you, Vidushi.
Thank you so much, sir, for the opening remarks and providing a background to this session. I would request the IT team now to release the launch video. Thank you so much. Now moving on to the presentation of the report. I hope my screen is visible to everybody.
Yes, Vidushi.
So this presentation is primarily divided into three components. The first segment aims to provide a background and context to why we really conducted the study. The second deals with the methodology and the process flow of this research-based study. And third are a few key takeaways and findings, as well as recommendations for the way forward that we deliberated upon. Now, after the committee of experts two reports on non-personal data, back in December 21, we witnessed the next big regulatory development in non-personal data regulation, which was the Joint Parliamentary Committee's report on the Personal Data Protection Bill of 2019. This asked to widen the ambit of the PDPB to include aspects of NPD. A few key proposed changes in this regard included renaming the bill from PDPB to DPB 21, which is the Data Protection Bill of 21, empowering the Government of India to frame rules on non-personal data, and provision for criminal liability in cases of re-identification of non-personal data. Noting this development, coupled with other developments that happened, which include the ONDC AA framework or the accounts aggregator framework as proposed by RBI, the draft national data governance framework, certain guidelines, etc. We decided to start questioning the seemingly shifting goalposts of data regulation in India from privacy to realizing the economic value of data. With this background, we decided to launch the second phase of a research-based study on NPD. The first being our preparation of two reports, that is navigating the puzzle of non-personal data sharing, and the second report being the dimensional analysis of future of non-personal data sharing. With this background, we started working on the launch of the report titled NPD 2.0. So as regards the process flow for our project, we started with comprehensive literature review as part of our desk research. Then we wrote extensively for one-on-one consultations with a range of stakeholders and received comprehensive feedback from both domestic as well as international experts working in the data domain. It is a part of this initiative that we are hosting all of you at this expert panel discussion today. Now, these are a few. This is a list of a few of the experts who gave very comprehensive comments on our report. Now, coming to the key focus areas of our report, as a starting point of our research study, we analyzed the incorporation of non-personal data in the Personal Data Protection Bill and ideated on the following issues. The first was whether regulation of non-personal data is premature and piecemeal. Does it actually dilute the privacy objective? Whether the non-personal data definition under the Data Protection Bill is very vague. Whether there is a risk of overburdening and worsening existing architectural issues in the Data Protection Authority. Whether the Government of India access to non-personal data is without guardrails. And lastly, what is its impact on the business community? Now, the key learnings and key recommendations that we arrived at included the exclusion of non-personal data from the ambit of the bill, operationalization of separate frameworks for personal and non-personal data, narrowing and a nuanced understanding of non-personal data, recognition of different categories of non-personal data, and also publishing informative guidance on the same. It also included recommending the restriction of DPA in cases of NPD breach and removal of references to such briefs. Lastly, the checks on Government of India access to non-personal data. With this, I come to an end of my presentation. Please feel free to write to us with comments, suggestions, and queries on the email IDs listed here. I now request Mr. Amol Kulkarni, the Director of Research at CUTS, to take over to moderate today's panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidushi, and thank you, Mr. Mehta, for your opening remarks. Vidushi, I would request you to please paste the link of our report on the chat box so that it is accessible to all. And welcome everybody for this very important discussion today. We have a stellar lineup of speakers to discuss this very important issue of data governance. We have Mr. Ritesh Pandey, who is Member of Parliament and has been a member of Joint Committee of Parliament on Personal Data Protection Bill. Mr. Parminder Jeet Singh from IT for Change, who has been part of the Committee of Experts on Non-Personal Data. Ms. Astha Kapoor from Aapti Institute, who has done phenomenal work on data governance, data stewardship, and community rights. Mr. Venkatesh Krishnamurthy from the Software Alliance, who is a leading voice on the area of data governance and data protection. Mr. Ashish Agrawal from NASSCOM, who represents the ITBP and Ministry of India and has been closely looking into the developments of data governance in India for quite some time now. Mr. Daniel Castro, who is a global expert on data. He is Vice President of ITIF and Director for Center for Data Innovation. Now, as you would notice, we have representation from different stakeholder groups, and to ensure that we are able to have a lively discussion, we would like to have multiple rounds of question and answer session, and therefore I would request speakers to limit their interventions to 5 to 6 minutes each. I would pose one question each to each of the speakers, and I would request them to talk about or provide their opening remarks on the theme of the discussion while answering to this question. And once we have covered all the speakers, hopefully we'll have more questions to discuss, and would request audience to feel free to pose questions to the speakers so that I can take them up in the subsequent rounds. Before going into the panel discussion, in addition to what Mr. Mehta and Vidushi said, I think just setting the context a little bit more clarity is need of the hour. So in past 7 to 8 months, what we have seen is starting with the JPC report on personal data protection bill, which incorporated non-personal data into the bill, expanding its scope. We have also seen a lot of sector-specific policies. Now, does that mean that the government is sidestepping the need for a robust legislative framework in favor of executive directions, which cover both personal and non-personal data, including data sharing, is something that we would like to debate today. In addition to that, we are seeing a lot of private sector movement in terms of data sharing, particularly on non-personal data. PhonePe had released its report, PhonePe Pulse, and it's sharing data. Uber has Uber Movement, and Google Maps is not hidden from by any way by anyone. In addition to that, government is also trying to put its house in order. It has released National Data Governance Framework Policy, which tries to take a whole of government approach and ensure data sharing within the government. Also, National Data Analytics Platform has been released, which is sort of an open data initiative by the government. At global level, also, we are seeing a lot of policy and practice level developments. We have Data Governance Act and the Data Act, which talk about data sharing, including of non-personal data. We also have initiatives like uh, GAIX and inspectors, which are private sector initiatives to promote data sharing. With these global and local policy and practice developments around data governance and data sharing, what we hope to achieve from this discussion is to design optimal way forward of how non-personal data governance in India should look like. And with this, I would like to first reach out to Mr. Pandey. So you have been part of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Personal Data Protection Bill. Uh, According to you, what should come first? Should we have a robust personal data protection bill first and then talk about governance or rules around non-personal data? And do you see any concerns with respect to the provisions in the in the data protection bill regarding access uh, regarding access of non-personal data by the government and direct and government's powers to direct data fiduciaries to provide its to provide non-personal data for several reasons which are mentioned in the bill. Over to you, sir.
Hello, thank you. I would like to begin by appreciating the work CUTS International does on cutting edge public policy issues, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Regarding if I believe that the government should first focus on personal data and then post that look at regulations around non-personal data. There were extensive discussions regarding this in the committee, and obviously at a certain point it was suggested by a few members, and also as you are aware and as was mentioned in the presentation, that the bill took a different turn where the word personal was removed, which essentially showed that the ambit of the bill was increasing and it wanted to include non-personal data as well within it. But at a personal level, I do think now, more so at the time, that it is probably important to first deal with personal data as a standalone, and then therefore, if the need arises, to again look into detail in non-personal data. Yeah. Sorry, and your second question, I sort of lost it a little bit.
Yeah, the second question. Yeah, was there are some provisions in the bill which empower government to direct data fiduciaries to provide non-personal data, and the data could be used for say targeted delivery of public services and for targeted policy making. So, do you think there are some concerns around some of these provisions, and what guardrails could be built around these provisions to prevent misuse?
So I think to give out certain, especially around policy initiatives, where the government wants to look at how best to deliver policies at the grassroots. The bill has provided for data to be shared, and there have been certain guardrails that are in place where non-personal data or sort of personal data can be affected. But moreover, I think the Committee on Personal Data was, trying to address issues around personal data, that how it is affecting an individual's data to provide security around it. So I think that essentially there have been enough guardrails to be provided in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Pandey. And I think what I hear is personal data regulation should precede non-personal data governance. Parminder, I think the committee of experts also recommended separating personal data governance from non-personal data. The bill mixes both the two frameworks. Subsequently, also, we are seeing a lot of policy directives which somehow mix both personal and non-personal data. Do you see them as a concern, as a sort of sidestepping legislative framework on personal and non-personal data? If you could tackle some of these questions, including what has been said earlier in your opening remarks. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amol, and thanks to Kutch for inviting me. This question is interesting because it's not only about what my views are on it, but what does that mean really? So I'll present some fact before my views on it, and it's a bit embarrassing to even to be talking about dealing with non-personal data without clarifying what does it mean to protect non-personal data. Now, let's try to understand. What do you mean by protecting personal data? Personal data can only be protected in relation to a fact that there is a subject of personal data. Protection of my personal data means that that data cannot be used against my interests. I will determine things, I can take it back. This is called protection of personal data. There's no meaning of protection without that subject being in the picture. You can't just protect data. There is protection accrues to some subject. Now let's shift to non-personal data. It can be protected in two ways. One, it could mean that non-personal data is protected in the sense that it cannot be de-anonymized. And we all talk about how it's possible and so on. Now, is that what you mean by protection of non-personal data? Because that becomes a personal data protection issue. It was always there in all versions of a PDP bill, and there are criminal provisions regarding it. So is that the meaning of non-personal data, that it cannot be anonymized? Or there is some meaning, because this meaning is already covered, and it means basically a personal data issue. What else could you mean by protecting non-personal data? Non-personal data, to be protected, needs to have a corresponding subject to which the protection will accrue. That's the only meaning about non-personal data protection. Let's try to understand how non-personal data exists. Let's talk about anonymized data. Data about me has been anonymized, and therefore we have taken away attributes which can trace it back to me. And therefore now it only exists in the form, say that a person of so-and-so age, so-and-so habits, does so-and-so things. And they are sketchy enough that it cannot be traced back to me. That's called personal data. This data does not exist just like that. It can only be included in attributes of other similar people. So it exists as a data of certain kind of people of certain age, of certain flying habits, is called non-personal data. The subject of non-personal data of this data is that type of people, which could be called a community or not, but certain type of people are the subject. And that data can only be protected vis-a-vis that subject, and you cannot meaningfully even talk about protecting non-personal data without identifying who is the subject to whom the protection accrues. So what was embarrassing to even talk about and say, I mean, this is good intentions. Everybody has good intention that non-personal data should be protected, but what does it even mean is not understood. So we need to clarify what is the subject, and that's what the non-personal data did. It was a conceptual leap to consider a collective subject of non-personal data. Now, there is no meaning, as I repeat, to protect non-personal data without identifying a subject. Well, there is an individual subject, there is a collective subject, and there is sometimes an in-between commercial subject. For example, there may be a shopkeeper whose data can be considered individual, or it could be commercial, which is slightly different. For example, the Digital Markets Act gives protection to shopkeepers' data or entities' data. That's a third kind of data, but largely individual, collective, and perhaps a commercial entity could be a subject. But my main proposition here is that without identifying the subject of non-personal data, it's not even meaningful to talk about protection. And therefore, it was completely an exercise in kite flying to, with all respect to everybody who was involved, to talk about protecting non-personal data. I mean, should be a little, I should use better words. It was an expression of good intents, basically, to say that we want to protect non-personal data without understanding the fact that analytically you can't protect non-personal data without first identifying the subject to whom the protection would accrue. And I'd stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Parminder. I think a very interesting points you made. I think perhaps I may clarify here that we're talking about non-personal data governance here, which is not necessarily limiting to the person in the sense, protection in the sense you are talking about it. Abuse of or misuse of non-personal data once it is accessed by the government or private sector entities, mandated enforcing mandatory sharing of non-personal data and consequent impact or unintended consequences is something that we have covered in the report and we would like to discuss. So I think we were talking about non-personal data governance in a very broader sense and not just from the perspective of protecting it vis-a-vis a particular entity. However, I think I'll come back to you again. I have a lot of more questions on what you said. I'd like to quickly move to Astha next. I mean, Astha, Parminder has touched a very important aspect of community interest or interest of commons vis-a-vis non-personal data, and you have done a lot of work around some of these issues as to how to think about that. Now, my question to you is twofold. First is if you could talk about some of your work in terms of how to think about community data and not vis-a-vis non-personal data governance. Secondly, are we there yet in terms of creating frameworks of non-personal data? Or first, we should have good experience of personal data protection, see how the frameworks are operationalized, and then think about non-personal data governance. Over to you, Astha. Thank you.
Thanks, Amol, for having me here, and also congratulations on the report. I'll answer your second question first on, like, are we there yet? I think that, I mean, our quest for data protection has been a long one, and for all of us who've been working on it, and, you know, every parliament section, we session, we're like, will it happen now? Will it happen now? So I think that the data protection framework is a long overdue one. And I think that for India to be a robust space for innovation, for experimentation with regard to data, even as we take on, you know, the leadership role, G20 is coming, many countries are looking at us. I think that we do need data protection in some shape or form. We may not 100% agree with the current bill as it stands now, but I think that you know, all of us in the room here can say that, you know, we do need some kind of framework, and that those rights are critical for us to start thinking about the next steps on what rights do we have as communities, you know, and also with regard to NPD. I think that, I mean, just to speak about our work, what we've been doing at Aapti Institute is trying to think about what are the ways in which collectives and communities can govern data. And there's a lot of conversation and around about this, particularly out of Europe, because the conversation on data trust is very much live, though it's been proved increasingly that data trust as a model need much more for them to be a reality. But there are other models such as cooperatives, collaboratives. You can even structure certain kinds of contracts that basically the idea is that communities should be able to draw value from the data that is generated by them, but as well as about them, because it's not just the data. I mean, and the NPD committee report does talk a lot about the relational value of data. What needs to happen is we need to think more critically about data as not just a commons resource, but a community resource. And communities need to be empowered to extract value as well as prevent harm. And again, this is the language of the NPD committee report, which, we've been big fans of, because I think that putting down the rights of a community with regard to data is extremely cutting edge. However, beyond that, how do we make that real is a question that we've talked about multiple times over the last couple of years. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to happen on the ground to sensitize people with regard to their data rights, and we're doing some of this work with existing institutions such as cooperatives that are used to taking decisions together, that are building shared experiences with regard to their data lives. And we're trying to see if there's a possibility of bringing all of that together and having people come together on data decisions. But much like individual data rights, I think community data rights also have a long journey of people being sensitized, understanding the value of data. One of the questions we've been trying to answer, and it's a difficult one, which is that what are the incentives for people to sign on to any kind of collective decision making with regard to data? There are very problematic solutions such as data monetization, which are also being suggested, that if a collective realizes that their data has monetary value, then they'll be more incentivized. But I think those are slightly perverse incentives that we need to think much more. And this government is repeatedly coming back to questions of monetization that we should all be, made aware of. So I think that the NPD committee, when it talks about community data rights, is the correct starting point. However, I think that we need to do much more than to even put it in policy. I think we need to spend this. I've been screaming myself hoarse for a while to say that we need to put money where our mouth is and start to experiment with some of this. In the UK, out of the Data Trust Initiative, there is some funding that has gone to 3 data trusts to figure out what that is. And I was just on a call with them, and you realize that the effort on the ground to work with people and help them understand the value of data and why they should decide collectively on it, that's a year's worth of work already. So it's all well and good to suggest some of this in policy documents, and that's critical. That top-down approach is critical. But I think we as a community need to do much more on the ground. And Amol, to your question, I think we do need these very forward-looking policy documents, but they need to be supplemented much more.
Thank you very much, Asta. I think work on the ground is absolutely needed to supplement what has been said in the policy. And we have clearly laid out the need for a community-driven, community-empowering approach when it comes to non-personal data, leveraging of non-personal data. I'd like to move to Daniel now. Daniel, we have heard what Parminder and Asta had to say, and also they have touched upon global developments in data sharing, including Data Act, Data Governance Act, and some of the private sector initiatives which are happening. If you could throw some light on what are you seeing from a global expert in terms of what is happening in data governance, particularly governance of non-personal data, and is there something which India can learn from the world, and world can learn from India? I think it would be great to hear your thoughts. Over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today and your report. I've already been leafing through it. It's excellent. So I think a few things. I mean, first, I agree wholeheartedly with Vidishu's recommendation that we need to separate out non-personal data from personal data. The priority around the world right now is around personal data protection, and in both cases, the goal should be to maximize use of data, maximize the economic value of data, but only personal data needs those exceptional protections to respect, personal privacy and data rights, such as data portability, to empower the consumer. For non-personal data, I think the question is more around access rights. So if you think about connected devices, the Internet of Things, you have a device owner and a device maker, who can use that data. I think that's where non-personal data rights, there are interesting debates there. And I think there are, that's where a lot of, some of the European policy is starting to think about in the future, how are we going to delineate who gets access to this data? But second, I think the goal should really be to address market failures. So, we are seeing, proposals and initiatives, like open data for government data, open banking, RBI's account aggregator framework for financial data. That type of open banking framework is very useful. I think that's a great thing to see, and we're seeing that come out of the UK, in the United States, we're seeing this. Australia, a lot of countries are pursuing open financial data. Open energy data is another area where we're seeing a lot of sector-specific initiatives to increase data access and innovation. But I think one of the key points here is that as governments and as policymakers are addressing some of these market failures, it's important that they don't create new market barriers, for example, by prohibiting data flows outside the country. So I think there's a balance here to be struck. The third area is around leveraging opportunities for government to spur data-driven innovation, especially when it's using maybe some soft law approaches rather than hard law. So not just regulating these different sectors, but also convening industry groups, organizing data sharing partnerships, and really shifting companies so that they're no longer competing based on whether they have access to data, and now they're competing based on what they do with that data. So it's a real shift in the kind of economic thinking and approach the countries are doing. And then the last point I just make in terms of where I think the conversation is going and what countries are doing is focusing on this point of inclusive innovation. And to me, the priority there means addressing the data divide. So, for decades now, we've been talking about closing the digital divide, and people understand that, when some people in some communities have access to computers and mobile phones and the internet and others don't, those that don't have access to the technology can't thrive economically. The exact same thing is true when we're talking about data. When some people in some communities have data about them, whether it's personal data or non-personal data about their communities, for example, they can thrive, they can benefit from lots of services, better decisions are being made about them. But when people don't have data about themselves and their communities, they can't thrive. And this is going to be a big issue. It's becoming an issue today. It's going to be a bigger issue tomorrow. And we're not talking enough about closing the data divide. And so when I think about kind of where both the data policy, especially around non-personal data policy, should go in the future, it should be around closing the data divide. I think that's what we want to see more and more in policy.
Thanks, Daniel. I think very important points on enabling access to data and closing the data divide. Ashish, one of the objectives of data governance approach which has been taken by the government is to enable access to data for startups and ensuring that they have adequate data for innovation and R&D and so on and so forth. But do you think that the current approach through which government is trying to enable access, particularly through mandatory sharing, etc., is the right approach? Are there any risks in this approach? And how can we ensure there are sufficient safeguards which can enable innovation and which can prevent unintended adverse consequences of the approach which government is trying to adopt? Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Amol, and thanks for inviting me. A lot of opening comments already made, and I think good points coming through there, so I'll not repeat them, but just a couple of points which I want to underline. One, I think what Asta talked about, and so unlike regulations when we are trying to do protection, non-personal data, as you also rightly said, is not so much about protection, right? And this calls for much harder work in terms of ecosystem enablement and doing all that, which cannot be, I mean, it would have been nice if it could be, but it cannot be just ordained by writing a policy or a law. And that's the difficult thing about it. We have seen it through some mixed success we have had with the NDSAP and so on and so forth going forward. So I think there is a whole amount of work that needs to be done to unlock the potential for innovation or empowering citizens and all of that. And therefore, it's an important topic where there is a role for the government, but is that role, can it be served by a kind of from a regulatory hat? I think that can only do a little bit, and we need to do, and that can be an enabling framework, and that's how that needs to be positioned. And then there is a lot more. So even getting the incentives right, not only from a private sector perspective, but even from a government perspective, why should the state governments and the central governments and the statutory authorities make sure that all the data that should be available publicly is available in an updated manner and all of that? What's the incentive really? So again, just mandating it could have some impact, but I think it needs to be aligned in all of that, right? So I think given the entire focus, a large focus is on enablement of innovation and empowering citizens and all of that. Therefore, a mandatory approach is only going to be that much useful as a starting point. I think that's one. And second, it's much more than just thinking of raw data and all of that, right? There is a lot of processed data or information, which again can be very useful when we talk about digitization in general, or even citizen services, or even just the e-governance initiatives. So I think non-personal data covers all of that. And as far as the protection part is concerned, I think to some extent there is a need for a comprehensive cybersecurity framework, which is where I think somewhere when now the data protection bill deals with data breaches, it steps away from the domain of personal data and probably steps into the domain of cybersecurity, and therefore just doesn't appear to be the right instrument to deal with it, and which should, in our view, be dealt more squarely under the amendment to the IT Act, which are hopefully also under consideration. So I think mandating sharing of data will have very suboptimal or short-term, maybe uncertainty and that kind of messaging, and not necessarily achieve the end objective. So that's the point on that. And I think overall, when you think of regulating data per se, I think on personal data, we can say that, okay, we are making haste slowly. I mean, given that so much time has passed, and now we are at a stage, hopefully let's get it into an implementation mode, and we should probably see that, we are hoping to see that sometime this year, we'll get to some progress there. But as far as non-personal data is concerned, I think what Mr. Mehta also called out in the very beginning, the discussions, I think they need to happen a little more. It will be good to see, for example, the expert committee's final report being released by government MeitY for discussion, or just generally for public knowledge as to what is that. But I think one area where I would give credit to the government thinking itself, if you read the latest draft of the National Data Governance Framework, I see, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I see a trend where it is moving away from, at least from a private sector perspective, from mandating to more enabling. So clearly that is there. And we are hoping that after a lot of effort and advocacy which has happened, and government is giving credit to them that they've actually listened to all the stakeholders, I'm hoping that we will see that the law on personal data protection will squarely, or at least substantially, if not entirely, focus on personal data protection. So I'll stop here, Amol. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ashish, as always, quite comprehensive and to the point. So personal data, the bill should focus on personal data. In addition to policy level inscriptions, there is a lot of work which is required on the ground. On that note, I would like to come to Venki. Venki, a lot of private sector initiatives have also been taken in terms of data sharing. And there have been concerns about mandating data sharing or unintended consequences on select stakeholder groups like data processors. So if you could talk a little bit about what are you seeing in terms of what are the private sector initiatives in terms of data sharing, what is the level of maturity they have reached, and do we also need to unpack the data fiduciaries, treat data processors separately, or treat some kind of data fiduciaries separately to others? And is there a need for more nuanced approach to data governance when it comes to non-personal data? Over to you to deal with some of these questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amol. Firstly, thanks to Cuts for putting this together. I just quickly skimmed through the report. So thank you for releasing the second version. The first version itself was quite good, and so I'm looking forward to reading that. Thanks to the fellow panelists for joining me here. So, and more importantly, thanks for all of the others who've tuned in just to listen to us. So a couple of points before I come directly to your question, Amol. So the consumer today is looking at increasingly looking at privacy and security as an important part of technology. I've been here for 5 years at BSA, and there's been a steady increase in discussions around privacy and security at a consumer level. I mean, of course, we are having these meaningful discussions in Delhi and in policy capitals across the world as PSA, but increasingly there are incidences which are prompting consumer to ask for this baked into the products that they use. So that's a good starting point for me to understand where are the consumers coming from, what do they want currently, and currently the need for privacy and security given the transformation that we have seen during COVID. The use of so many technological tools for everyday living has increased, and so this has become a fundamental part of our lives. And to that point, I say this need by consumers to focus on privacy and security also forces a response. What's that response? The response is governments across the world and including private sector participating in those discussions should be looking at privacy and security policies to be up and running as quickly as we can look at. Of course, we have to make sure that we consider due process, consultation, stakeholder engagement while we do that. So security and privacy policy should come front and center. That's my first claim. So when it comes to non-personal data, while part of it might involve security considerations, a lot of non-personal data related, let's say, policy frameworks would try to unlock the innovation, which is what the Nandan Nilekani, the NPD committee report also was looking at, would also try to unlock the innovation. Let me put it this way. They're also having a slightly different function here, which is to look at how do you unlock innovation? How do you share the benefits of the data revolution to stakeholders across the ecosystem? So these are the two aspects of the NPD piece which we need to look at, right? So the reason why I mentioned that is, as some speakers, Asta, I think, and also Parminder pointed out, that we need first clarity, and also how do we look at some of these new concepts as they develop. I think those are things that we need to understand as we look at any NPD related governance framework. So I look forward to the committee's latest report coming in, and hopefully we can comment on it. Specifically, to come to your point on data processors. So thank you. I saw that in the report. So as BSA, we represent a lot of the data processor. We represent the data processor, the enterprise software, the cloud service providers. The requirements of the tech industry are different. There are different players in the ecosystem. We represent a particular kind of technology companies who are largely working with companies who collect data from consumers, right? So there are businesses that collect data from consumers as controllers or a consumer facing businesses, and then there are companies who do work on their behalf, and BSA represents them. So one of the challenge that we have been facing, and this was addressed successfully quite in the NPD committee report, the version 1, was to say that as processors, we would not have access to that data. While we process them on behalf of our consumers or data controllers, it would not be possible for us to even voluntarily share the data that we have because of contractual obligations and commitments that we have with our customers. So this is another challenge to understand, right? And governments are looking at even mandatory data sharing, which we caution against. that we would not be in a position to share that data because that data is not owned by the data processors. So I think that is, I mean, I was happy to see that's being reflected in the report. So that's been a big challenge. Now, final question that you asked, how are companies looking at it? I mean, companies definitely want to unlock this piece. And so to that point, I would definitely congratulate the government of India for publishing so the second version or of the national data governance policy. We see good aspects of it. It also addresses a little bit of the privacy and security concerns that are flagged earlier. So I think this is a good step from the government, because government needs to be promoting data sharing within. And as private companies, there are a few challenges which you are facing. I'll come to that in further remarks. But the main thing that companies are trying to do is unlock innovation, share data sets that they have within themselves so they can promote downstream and upstream companies, purely because their products and services would get better if there are an ecosystem of products that consumers can use. And that's where I'm coming from, that's saying that this is a good and necessary movement in the non-personal data governance policy, but it might be too soon to be jumping into some sort of a hardwired regulation.
Thanks, Anki. Thank you for your very valuable comments. I must say that we are receiving a lot of questions for the panelists, and I will try to use the second round by directing one question each to each of the panelists, and if you could answer that in your thoughts. I understand Asta has to leave a bit early, so I would like to start with her. Asta, we have heard what others are saying. There is a specific question for you, which is that we have talked about empowering communities and sort of consumers in general in the quest of consumer and community empowerment. Can we learn from examples in other sectors, particularly finance and others, for community empowerment to enable and ensure that communities can benefit from non-personal data sharing and extracting the value for them?
Perfect. No, apologies, I have to drop off a little bit earlier, but thank you for that question. I think that this example of communities coming together and sharing data and extracting value, we are starting to see some examples of that, and there are examples even in the report which have been helpfully put together. So for instance, in the field of healthcare, you see a fair number of data cooperatives coming up where patients will come together, pool their data, and try to deploy it, usually for research, or also usually for research. So there are examples of patients of multiple sclerosis realizing that they are not able to get what they need from the existing amount of information that's available, but choose to pool their data through a data cooperative, sell it to researchers, so they get value in terms of more tailored research, but also some small monetary returns as well. Similarly, we're seeing that in the context of app hailing devices, there are examples that are coming up of drivers building cooperatives and pooling their data, and both understanding the apps better, because there's an opacity with regard to the use of, say, Uber, Ola, Grab, Lyft, whatever you may. So understanding the decisions made by the apps much better, because they're able to see share data with each other, as well as with and also with the municipalities that then can use this data to make better decisions, etc. So you are seeing some examples, but they are at a very minimal, small scale. So you will see these cooperatives that are of a few hundred members. Nothing really exists at scale. And I think that the business model question of data cooperatives or stewards in general is a big one. And like I said, incentives, which Ashish also touched upon, is another big question. And I think that broadly, what we need to do is to create that ecosystem where there's trust in the process of sharing, and stewards are only one part of that. I think questions of data quality, for instance, is a big one. With the use of data, what is it deployed for is another one. And creating these mechanisms of trust like stewards is something that can help facilitate the use of NPD much, much more. So I'll pause there, but thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Asta. I think these are some of very valuable thoughts which stakeholders can take away with them in terms of how to think about empowering communities for leveraging the value of data. I would like to come to Mr. Pandey next. There are some questions for him. I'm not sure if he's around, but so we wanted to know what is the status of the data protection bill, given that there have been some news reports around non-personal data being taken off from the data bill. Sir, are you around? I think he has dropped off. Maybe we can come to him later. But Parminder, there are some questions for you also. First, obviously, is if you could talk about the status of the report. Is it going to be public? Are you aware? The third report of committee of experts. And there have been a lot of points about how to sort of ensure real-time or on-ground implementation of the suggestions that were made by the committee of experts. So, is there something that you are seeing on ground in terms of implementation of the suggestions? And I think there is one last question which is there for you in terms of governing mixed data sets, given that I think the committee of experts talked about providing precedence to the personal data bill, and there was some confusion with respect to how to govern mixed data sets. So if you could tackle these questions in your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Amol. First, the status of the report is that I am dying to share it with you, but I can't share it with you. That's the status for many months. Ashish knows how many reams and reams of emails we wrote and discussed and distilled, and all that work we are very, very eager to share with you. I'm happy that someday it will be shared with you. That's where we are. So that's the status. Second question was, before I come to the second question, I think I'll go back to the conceptual issues, and I think they still need clarity. Amol also responded to my question. I still hold that you can't have protection without a subject. Cybersecurity, now it is possible, as Ashish was saying, that it is NPD's protection is a cybersecurity issue. Well, then we have to discuss, because in personal data, privacy is different from cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a breach. Somebody, despite all protections, takes away data. Privacy and PDP is not about breach. There is normal, some company takes my data, and whether they can use it, whether I can take it back, etc. It's not about cybersecurity. So we know that the difference in that side. In NPD, either we can decide it is a cybersecurity issue, then it's a very different thing, that it has to need more protections, better rooms, etc. However, I still stick to it that it is a protection issue in the sense of a community of patients of a rare disease need certain community rights about something said about that particular disease type, which cannot be identified to each person. Gay communities need protections, for example, about data, which city restaurants they visit. There's just a gay community. You don't know which ones. But if that information is available, and it could be true of many communities, about which restaurants they visit more can be used to harm them in many ways, which you can think about. So there are protections, which is different from cybersecurity issue, and the protection issue would require the data subject. I am open to be given an example of what do you mean by protecting NPD without it being accruing to a certain group. It doesn't mean anything, because everybody is, somebody is losing and somebody is gaining when NPD is used. It could be an enemy state, it could be a big corporation, it could be anyone, it could be opportunistic, actor. So who is losing? And you have to have a subject. That's the main thing. About the issues, what is happening on the ground, there are a lot of farmers collectives in Europe. I was talking to Europe officials day before yesterday. They have a code of conduct for sharing data, which includes NPD kind of data. They're also struggling with the question of IoT data as one kind of NPD data. And now they have a health data space regulation, which is purely an NPD mandatory sharing regulation for health data. Now, we may come to the question whether vertical sector-based regulation is enough or horizontal is needed. So I'm just saying these are the issues to discuss. Why horizontal? Where horizontal is not needed, vertical. So let me be very clear, EU has a mandatory NPD sharing draft legislation right now in the health sector. They are going to come to agriculture, I can assure you. They're going to come to education. Transport, they have partly. So this is happening, and let's put that together. Whether things are happening on the ground, these are the things happening on the ground. To the Aastha's issue, and others have said, it's never, I am an activist, I work in gender issues, on agriculture, farmers. We never do either or between policy making and things on the ground. I never heard anybody says that let's improve women's rights on the ground first before bringing in a law to defend women's rights. No, it never happens like that. Both come together. I've never heard educationist teachers saying that, oh no, let's first make schools and then get a right to education bill. Those things happen together. And they learn from each other, and then things roll ahead. And the last question, Ramol, was?
Mixed data sets.
So mixed data sets, yes, we have a problem, but you also realize that we cannot give escapes to those people who we need to govern. If we just say that mixed data sets are outside the purview, I have to simply do whatever I wish to do with NPD by mixing a little personal data into it and say, no, well, excuse me, I mean, this is now mixed data set, so it's outside your purview of your law. That cannot be allowed. No law can be such an ask to allow that to happen. So right now, you'll have to separate it for two kinds of governance, or angularly, two kinds of governance will apply. So the mixed data set, to the extent there is personal data in it, would be the personal data protection will be applicable. To the extent it is non-personal data, that will be applicable. If you can prove that they're inextricably mixed, then probably it will be governed as personal data, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Parminder. Very valuable comments as always. I think one of the points was that we are not talking about whether NPD regulation first or NPD on the ground first, but also about whether we have a personal data protection bill first or act first, and then think about NPD governance as well as practices on ground. So let's have a personal data first, perhaps, and understand and get more experienced, and perhaps then go about the other aspects. But I think Mr. Pandey is back. Sir, can you hear me? We have some questions for you. Mr. Pandey?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And sorry to put you on spot, but we are receiving a lot of questions from you. First is, if you can let us know about the status of the data protection bill, if you are aware. What is happening, given that there are a lot of news reports about would it incorporate non-personal data, would it not incorporate non-personal data, whether it will be.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure that it does not incorporate non-personal data. I think that is now being looked at separately, as you can see with NITI coming up with these reports. And I think that the name of the bill has again gone back to what it was essentially. So that speaks a lot for itself. As far when it's going to be implemented, with a bit of movement that is happening, I think a lot of anticipation is around it coming in this session. But frankly, I'm also on the same page as you or anybody else who's away from the government and doesn't, really know what they're up to and how and when they can put forward any legislation, so to say. So, but the report is ready. The final draft has gone in, and I think that it should be with us maybe in this session.
That's great to know, Mr. Pandey. Thank you so much for that. There was one other question for you, but it's up to you if you want to take that or not. So This question was that the government policy seems to suggest that it's trying to collate or consolidate a lot of data on both personal and non-personal from different government departments. So would consolidation of personal and non-personal data at the government level from different departments enhance the risks of re-identification and abuse and misuse, and how can we address some of these risks till the time the personal data protection bill is not adopted?
I think it totally increases the risk and aggregation of such data, and then inferring from it, and then later again trying to send it back. I think it does lead to a lot of risks that can arise from it. How can we look to reduce such risk until the data protection law is not in place? To think about it, this question is a little bit difficult, because as far as there are no laws, it's actually the government that has the upper hand, and what they do with this data and how they handle it is really something that can hardly be questioned on their part, unless one happens to knock the doors of the courts. So I think that until the law is in place, I think it's probably best that hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I think it's best that that such data is not really put together, and but then of course the government has its obligations also. I mean, it does need to provide services on the ground. It does need to pull in this data and be able to deliver services and schemes that need to go to people. And in order to streamline those indices, there is need to do this. But then the safety and security of it is something that can only come into place when the law is being implemented. And that, I think, still is, we are a little bit far away from it. I think, once it's even formed, there will be the authority, and the authority has to come in. There's a formation of it. So I think it will be a long time, at least a few years, before we see anything substantial happening in that end.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pandey. Thank you for your thoughts. I'll like to go to Daniel now. Daniel, you have heard other panelists speak about developments in India and abroad also, and there is some thought of whether there should be a cross-sectoral initiative on non-personal data or sector-specific. So what are your thoughts on that? And in addition to that, there's a specific question for you which says that re-identification of non-personal data may attract criminal liability under the data protection bill. Can you throw some light on international jurisprudence in this regard, especially considering that that de-anonymization may not be 100% and such risk may never be brought down to zero? Over to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Two great questions. I think what we've seen is that sector-based regulation of data can be very useful because there just are always differences between sectors, and in particular, there's differences in motivations. There's differences in the actual types of data that are being exchanged. And so what we've seen is that, for example, again, to take banking as an example here, when you had government come in and create a framework to encourage data sharing within a particular sector, but with industry leading that change, it can be very useful because the industry can come in, they can work together and say, this is the standard we want to use. These are the key issues that we're running into, and they're not doing that on their own. Government's helping push them along. There's a reason that we're seeing these government initiatives, and industry hasn't just done this on its own. But industry-led is still very useful, and so I think that works best when it's sector-specific. Transportation, education, energy, all of these areas, it can be sector-specific and very useful. I think having a cross-cutting framework, these are the types of issues you need to think through in each sector. Here are some of the menu of items you can use to address it. I think that kind of top-down, cross-industry, cross-sector approach can be useful. But at the end, the solutions need to be sector specific. On the question of criminal liability, especially around de-anonymization or de-identification of data, just the other day, for example, in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission put out a blog post. Now, blog posts are never policy, but they give you a pretty good indication of what they're thinking about. And they came and said that that they were going to be going after companies that were making claims about anonymization of data that they couldn't back up. And so that was a pretty strong statement there. It was a warning shot, to companies, to businesses, that said, if you are saying data is protected because it's anonymized and you can't back that up, that they may be taking enforcement actions against you. And so, I think these are the types of issues that we're going to increasingly see, where, there are ways that you can, of course, make data less identifiable. But when you de-identify it, oftentimes you want to follow that up with contractual obligations. Not only is the data de-identified, but you're also, when you give it to a third party, there's a contractual agreement that they can't re-identify it, or that they can't combine it with other data sources or send it in other places that could allow for re-identification. So I think, there's more work that's going to be done in that space. I think that the challenge, though, is, and I think at least, where I've seen this in other countries, when criminal liability is raised, nobody, of course, wants that in a business, right? And so that can also have an extreme dampening effect on data sharing, even in ways that are beneficial, because it's no longer a question about some financial risk that might be managed. Now it's about, again, criminal liability for executives. And there's going to be significant restrictions on data sharing there in ways that maybe are unintentional. So I don't think, criminal liability should be on the table for most of this. We're talking about compliance issues that should be, associated with, risk, right? The risk-based framework where companies have an incentive to minimize risk. That's what we really want. And so, hopefully, that's the approach that we'll see more and more.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Completely on board with you in terms of risk-based approach and the criminalizing some of these provisions. Ashish, we have a couple of questions for you. First is, you have talked a lot about cybersecurity and sort of from that angle in terms of non-personal data. And the question is that I think under the current draft of the data protection bill, the authority has been empowered to tackle issues with respect to NPD breach and so on and so forth. So do you think that is the right approach, or is this overburdening too much too soon to the data protection authority? And secondly, there are a lot of concerns around intellectual property rights and violation of trade secrets when it comes to mandatory data sharing or data sharing with the government. So what are your thoughts on some of these issues, and how do we deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amol. So I think on the first, it's fairly clear that if you want to address cybersecurity issues, which you must, I think there is a lot of work that has happened since 2020. We're all waiting for the cybersecurity strategy to get implemented in some form, and now, as I mentioned earlier, we're hoping this gets squarely addressed in the IT Act. The new Digital India Act should take care of that. I think that just sets it up properly. And there are some other provisions also around hardware certification and all that in the current bill. So even that, in some sense, probably best taken care at a sectoral level, because then you can look at it from a risk-based approach. And so that entire, I think, you can spare the DPA and the personal data protection law from that thing, because it just brings some clarity to that. On this, the thing about, I think you probably need another session if you go into a deeper discussion on this IP protection and trade secret and all of that, because what you're opening up for discussion is trying to probably have some kind of ex-ante regulatory intervention to address competition issues at some level, right? While it might have an intent of enablement from a point of view of smaller enterprises and so on and so forth, but somewhere that's the entire discussion that could open up, and it's a good discussion to have at some level. But I think But listening to this conversation, at least for me, the takeaway seems to be that if we come to a little more surety that on personal data protection bill, we are actually focusing on personal data, and that's great. So that's a good win for everybody, and that's a way forward. And then you take the national data governance framework, the draft, and the subsequent press conference where the Minister of State talked about it. I think both the things seem to give a fair bit of insight into the government's mindset, which is to say that let's get this personal data protection framework out. It will take its own time in terms of 2 to 3 years minimum to get to some level of operationalization, and stability might come later. And on this, I think the work ahead, the way we would want to think about it is that on non-personal data is that let's bring all the thinking that has already been done and then see that how can we now work with the government on the next step of the national data governance policy itself, because the policy is a very, it's kind of at a 10,000 feet, at a framework level, doesn't really go into details, which is fine. And hopefully the final draft will clean up some of the inconsistencies in drafting and so on and so forth. So then I think the next step should be for us to actually look at what can we do as a group to bring together thinking on operationalizing that policy well. So, like I wouldn't put it onto a single document or a law. So I wouldn't be stuck with the expert committee report or what the IT Act can itself do, or what this nation, existing policies can be improved. But I would certainly think that aligning that all in the context of the national data governance framework and can we make that successful over a period of time could be one good outcome in the context of non-personal data. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashish. So, Venki, I think what I'm hearing is that there could be a separate personal data protection bill, then there could be a cybersecurity policy or a framework devoted to that. Then there could be a national data governance framework which talks about data sharing and all. But the question to you is, and which has also come from some of the audience member, is that what's the role of competition authority in all of this? Because the ultimate objective from where it all started was to prevent misuse of data by data monopolies, and therefore we had thought about sort of breaking those monopolies and enabling access to data by smaller players and startups. So, and globally also we are seeing a lot of empowering which is being done to the competition authority. Is there something more which we need to do in India as well? Are you seeing some developments in this regard? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amol. I mean, I think before we are able to move forward and solve challenges regarding competition, I think someone else mentioned this in the discussion. So there's a primary question of trust, right? I mean, making sure that trust, especially in the context of privacy and security, that consumers, users across are able to trust the medium. We've seen, at least in the last few years, with respect to tech clash and with respect to the general sort of approach to policy making across the world. I mean, not just in India, whether it's Australia, whether it's EU, whether it's US, the focus seems to be on maintaining the balance of trust. So that seems to, so what you're talking about, I mean, this multiplicity of laws and multiplicity, in some sense, regulators, is trying to solve a problem of trust, whether it's privacy, security, and some of the data sharing mechanisms also. While they are trying to address promoting competition, they're also trying to make sure that the benefits of data, the benefits of the data innovation are being shared with across the community and across the stakeholders in the tech ecosystem and consumers. So one, I'd say, is the need to continue to focus on trust is important, because the moment you lose trust, especially with a a device or something like that, it's very tough to get it back. So that's an important challenge. And the second part that you specifically talk about competition, yes, I mean the movement towards enabling more competition in the tech ecosystem is quite. I mean, it's moving quite fast. It started again in EU. So the DMA, DS. I mean, there are 3-4 policies that have come up in the last 6 to 9 months that are focusing on that. The challenge over there being that you need to have to be able to develop a tech ecosystem that could then take the mantle forward in some sense, and that what our experience when we have analyzed policies across the world, restrictive policies are never able to do that. So whether it comes to restricting data flows or promoting a particular kind of it's a particular company from a nationality or something of that sort, it's increasingly challenging in the digital world to make restrictive policies because innovation is moving so fast. And if you are having restrictive policies, consumers might not like products coming out of, say, such firms. So I think to promote competition, it's far more important to be able to balance the markets in terms of making sure there is right amount of innovation and freedom with all the safety and security guaranteed to the users. Regulatory policies on competition, it's still going to be more challenging for it to enforce and come together with any meaningful ways to promote competition just yet. But I think far more can be achieved if you are able to facilitate innovation, promote more companies, and make sure that you are able to empower or give users with the products and services they want. I mean, that's a far more easier solution to promoting competition and innovation.
Thank you so much, Pinky. And I think consumer empowerment and providing them more options is always music to our ears from a consumer advocacy point of view. Perhaps a national competition policy which can enable and put all of this in one framework is in the order. It has been pending since last 10 years or so. Perhaps it could be updated and adopted. I think we are just coming close to the end of this webinar. Before we move to the closing remarks by my colleague, I would request each of the panelists to provide their wish list, parting thoughts in 1 minute each, considering what has been discussed and what do they think should be the way forward in data governance 2.0 for India. Mr. Pandey, if you are here, can we start with you? Your closing remarks. I think maybe we can come back to you later. Parminder, would you like to go?
Yeah, 2 points and a great discussion. Thanks, Amol, for organizing this. One is that we need more conceptual clarity, and we need to abstract ourselves as public policy issues because things are fundamentally changing. It's not one small thing that we can do bargaining. We are looking at society-wide, rearrangements, and then we have to kind of abstract ourselves from our narrow interest to slightly go up and really see what's happening, and then come down to our narrow interest, which is everybody does, and they have to do. And what I mean to say, for example, is I was yesterday at Agriculture Ministry meeting. What has happened around farmers? It's very easy to say agri-tech, and I gave them the example. Take Uber. When Uber started, they were getting 70 to 80,000 bucks. Every time I sit in an Uber, same Uber did provide efficiency, but how did the distribution of that value take place now? Those guys are counting the number of rupees they are able to send home and the rent they pay. All of them are. What happened? So these distributional issues are important. So the trader on Amazon, the farmer, everybody's interests are included, and those people are not a part of this debate. Industry-led looks like a very beautiful line, but why industry-led and not farmer-led is something I've never been able to understand. Why not farmer-led? Why not the trader-led who's losing? So I mean to say that it is now a new social contract kind of thinking. Let's abstract out, look at all categories, look at efficiencies, and look at distributive aspects both at the same time, and to which I must add the angle of geopolitics. There is an issue of digital colonization. It's a serious, serious thing. We have to save our national sovereignties. EU today is the biggest utterer of the world digital sovereignty. people use the word sovereignty when they're losing it largely. That's what the value becomes more important, right? So these things, if happening in Europe, is happening to India also. So these are bigger questions. So let's get together and look from a larger public interest angle, these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Parminder. I think equity and distribution issues are very, very important to look at, and we are doing separately a lot of work around that. And I would be more than happy to also continue this conversation. Mr. Pandey, if you are here, your closing thoughts, please.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, as a member of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Data Protection Bill, I can say that the bill was an excellent example of balancing the trifecta of rights-based privacy framework of data principles, an enabling environment for industry and the state, which acts as both the data fiduciary itself and as well as the implementer of data protection regime. And this is what I would also sort of hope that when finally, this draft report that has come out, when it finally comes with a final set of framework rules that that would govern the non-personal data, I hope that it sort of addresses these key areas and assures that from all these angles we have a good set of framework that would govern non-personal data as well and allow for competition to flourish, but at the same point also assure that we are protecting an individual's right to privacy as well that might be inferred from such data as well in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Thank you so much. Daniel, closing thoughts?
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think my last remark would just be that I'm thankful we haven't come back to the kind of common trope that data is oil or data is gold. And I think that though has underpinned a lot of policy, and so it's important to emphasize that unlike oil or gold, with oil and gold, only the one that extracts that mineral gets its value. But data is non-rivalrous. You can use it, I can use it, many companies can use it, and that doesn't take away anything from anyone else. And so I think the reason that matters so much is because the focus and the policy should always be about maximizing use of data. It doesn't really matter who's using it because its use is what creates value for the companies, creates value for the company's users, and it creates value to the community and countries. So really, all of this policy should be focused around maximizing data use. I think that's how we can all succeed.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Ashish, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think three things. One, let's hope and get the personal data protection bill in a shape and form which actually is very useful, and hopefully that happens soon. I think on non-personal data, there is a lot that can be done within government to enable access of high quality updated data in a manner that can be used by everybody, both central, state government, even some statutory authorities. And that's something it's a work in progress, but more power to that. I think that's important. And third, I think from a private sector involvement perspective, we should definitely build some important use cases. I think that's what the committee of experts also probably highlighted in their discussions, and let those use cases make the case for market-based models to grow and develop. And that is what we should try. And in that process, if we comes across some challenges which require regulatory intervention and which requires state to do thing by regulation, then that's something that should always be discussed and debated and thought about. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashish. Definitely, I think role of states and other regulatory institutions is something that we didn't touch, but some other time maybe very important issue that you have pointed out. Venki, last thoughts?
Yeah, so three last thoughts from my end. One, first, the focus should definitely be on personal data when it comes to privacy. There's quite a bit of work to be done there. So I think keeping the focus sharp would benefit not just the industry, but the larger ecosystem. Number two, as far as non-personal data, when it comes to sharing of non-personal data, it should be a voluntary mechanism as opposed to anything mandatory. And subsequent to that, specifically when it comes to non-personal data sharing, given that data processors might not have access to the data that needs to be shared, it would be prudent to keep them out of any such voluntary data framework that the government might come up with. And those are kind of the three ways we are looking at non-personal data. And we also want to underscore that it is a developing field of work. And so it's important to look at some of these questions far more deeply before we look at any such broad legislation in the NPD. Thank you. That's it from my end.
Thank you so much, Vinky, and we have come to close of this panel discussion. Thank you so much, speakers and others for joining. I will now request my colleague Siddharth to deliver the closing remarks and vote of thanks. Over to you, Siddharth. Thank you.
Thank you, Amol, and thank you to our distinguished speakers who joined us today, as well as the interactive audience that we had. This was a rich discussion held today, and this will certainly help us in refining our research agenda on the way forward on this subject. While I think the closing round has already summarized most of the wish list of the speakers, however, just a few points which Kutz would like to take forward from this discussion is that India has been recognized as the fastest growing digital economy. However, it still lacks a personal data protection law. This issue is only going to be highlighted further with evolving technologies like 5G, IoT, and connected devices coming in, which would increase the generation of data. With respect to non-personal data in particular, perhaps more clarity and in-depth research is needed to better determine its scope and its definitions and putting them in different buckets. This will help us in regulating NPD in a manner which empowers communities to draw value from the data which has been generated by them and belongs to them, and prevent any harm which may emanate from such non-personal data. It is heartening to note that NPD is unlikely to be covered within the ambit of the Personal Data Protection Bill. However, research would still have to continue on how to adopt a bottom-up approach, and also research on the interests of different stakeholders and how they can be balanced together. The role of Data Protection Authority and its interface with the Competition Commission of India and the need for a national competition policy has also been well noted by us. We would definitely like to research more on this and keep you all engaged as and when we move forward in this direction. We also welcome any feedback or thoughts on reactions on the report, the link of which has already been put on the chat box. That will also help us in fine-tuning our work and refining our own thinking on the subject. With this, I once again thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much and enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining, and hope to work with you and engage with you soon and more. Thank you so much.